Okay. Oh, it's coming up. Coming up.
Can people hear me online? Okay. But can they see the slides or where? Okay. Uh, okay. Thanks for confirming. Okay. Sorry to keep everyone waiting. This was. We'll try to make do with what is the best. Sure. I think there is some lag. Okay. Okay. This part of the chair is also there.
Now connect. No?
Yes. You can connect the. But then
No, it's not coming. Oh, you wanted both in this side. Haven't worked that way, no. It's-
I don't think they'll be able to see the slides.
Which one?
It's not clear.
Hold this. Take this table. Take one. Wait. Yeah, you stand there.
Everything. Audio is coming and everything is coming.
But will these get able to hear the audio? Through that.
Can we hear? Yes, maybe.
Can people hear me? Okay. So sure. Is this because of this or without this? So I think that microphone is being used, right? Okay. Hello. So the internet is also probably the best. And the results. No, but I want to write here.
Sir, one time I will try, sir. Yes, one time I will try, sir.
Okay. What your class is?
So yesterday it's working.
Study new. Every day is new. Morning it should work continuously. It is randomly never works.
What changed?
I think we'll go ahead with this thing. I will keep the chair above or something, see one thing.
See.
Okay, so I'll maybe add a little bit and then we can see if we can join online. So, really sorry about the hiccups and so let's resume. I was broadly talking about what language processing is, engineering of building models that can handle human text. You are accustomed or you've seen a lot of these applications already in your day-to-day life, probably without even noticing or realizing. So let's say when you're completing an email or responding to a friend using WhatsApp, it starts to suggest the next options. Or when you're, let's say, searching online, it gives you answers directly, like how many times did India win the World Cup? You can directly get the answer. This is again an NLP application. Similarly, you have seen and talked to Siri, Alexa, and all of the speech recognition processing, everything falls within NLP broadly. And of course, like you have used GPT at some point of time, ChatGPT at some point of time. Like there are several use cases, be it summarization, writing content, answering your homework questions, creative content, like generating ads, coming up with clever titles, question answering, problem solving to some degree, and so many more use cases. So a lot of these NLP applications that we try to cover as a part of this short course. So let me begin by sharing why language understanding is so critical, right? We use language as a means to communicate. That's how we share thoughts with other people. That's how we share our intentions, our desires. Uh, Majority of the data out there is textual in nature. So if you're working for a company, you probably realize this already. A lot of it is in textual format. So if you want to make sense of the available data, you need NLP tools to crunch that data. And another reason why we should focus on understanding language is it's a key component of intelligence, right? If we are going to build intelligent machines, we ideally want them to be able to communicate with us in our own languages. So understanding language is a key component. At the same time, handling human languages is hard. Words can mean very different things in different languages, different cultures. Anybody here wants to give me an example of how one word means very different things in different cultures? Any, for instance, the word uh, bill, right? In India means like a receipt or how much you're supposed to pay. If you go to a restaurant, you ask for a bill, and maybe you can pay that with a check if you want. Whereas if you are in the US or in the West, a bill is a currency note. So you like a dollar bill, right? So in US, you would ask for the check, which means the receipt, and you will pay through the bill. Whereas in India, you will ask for the bill and pay through the check. So, so different words can mean very different things in different contexts and cultures. Similarly, let's say the word sincere here might mean dedicated, whereas sincere in other places means genuine. So different words have different connotations, even to 0 can never happen, p equal to 1 can never happen, right? So depending upon different values of p, the likelihood of observing data might change, and you are interested in finding the p that maximizes the likelihood, right? This estimate is also called as an MLE estimate, maximum likelihood estimate, right? So uh, this is something you might have done at some point, but we'll use this over and over again in the class, so I thought I'll introduce it. So you are aware of Bernoulli. You might also be aware of categorical distributions. They are just simple extensions of Bernoulli. So instead of rolling a coin, you roll a dice. Just 1 second. So dice could potentially take values between, let's say, 1, 2, 2, 6. Right? And now if you were to roll this 100 times, and you observe that for 50 times you find a 1, for 20 times you find a 2, and so on, right? Again, you will suspect that this is not a balanced die. Like if it was a balanced die, it's very unlikely to observe 50 times 1. Could happen, but just very unlikely. So if you compute the MLE estimate of observing 1, you will say that the probability of observing 1, or the probability of the die giving you 1, is 1 upon 2, 50 upon 100. This is the, again, like it could be 0.4, it could be 0.6, but this is the estimate that maximizes the data that I have, maximizes the likelihood of the data that I have, right? Questions? Yeah. No, so again, like your estimates would become better if you have more occurrences, obviously. Yeah, with one occurrence, you either land a heads or a tails. So you will be tempted to conclude that it is a fully biased coin, either always gives heads or always gives tails. But again, if you observe more data, your estimates would be better. Okay. Any more questions? So you're getting a feel for how MLE estimates work, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So it might happen that if you observe next 10 matches, there are only 6 heads. And if you just had that sequence, you would be tempted to conclude 0.6. Similarly, like one idea is like if you have lots of data, aggregate all the data and use all the data to estimate your MLE, which is what is typically done or makes sense, right? So, or you should be willing to update if your data has changed. Let's say distributions have changed. Maybe they brought in a new coin. All that can happen. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So that's good point. Like there are ways to actually come like have a prior belief that this is an unbiased coin. So unless there is a lot of evidence, I'm willing to believe that it is 0.5 heads tails, and I will change my belief only when we see more data. So if you see 1,000 tosses and you observe that 700 are heads, then maybe you are okay in updating your belief. So those are called map estimates, which are slightly different from MLE estimates. You can look them up, where you can also account for a prior belief that you have, like it's an unbiased coin. But here it could be an unbiased coin or biased coin. We will just compute the MLE based on the data we have. Okay, cool. So let's talk about language models, and I'll connect how MLE estimates are useful for language models. So first of all, everybody's talking about language models. So what are language models? Language models are just nothing but machines that can compute probability of sequence of words. So you throw in a sequence of words to, let's say, a black box. It will give you a probability of how likely is that sequence, right? How likely is that sequence to, let's say, have been written by a human being? So if I give you lots of these sequences, 1, 2, 3, 4, assignments working. We are working on our assignments. We assignments working are on our. So you might come to realize that this particular sequence looks like one that might have been written by a human being. So this should get ideally a higher probability than, let's say, the other sequences, right? This is roughly the functionality that is desired here. Language models are models that give you probabilities of sequence of words, right? So you put in sequence of words, you can put in gibberish like blah 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 blah. It will give you the probability of that, right? Yes, yes. So these three will also have some probabilities, but very low probabilities. Okay. So ideally, we want to get to a machine that can help us do this. So that's basically like a very simple definition of what a language model is. Okay. So if we had this machine, we can obviously use it for a whole lot of things, right? So let's say if I had this sentence and this sentence, let's say someone said that these are all the possible candidates that could be corrections for this sentence. I know that the first one should be less likely, the second one should be more likely. If my language model is trained appropriately, and if it's a good language model, which means it assigns higher probabilities to things that people actually write, then the second one will have a higher probability, and I can use a component of the large language model to say that, yeah, the second one looks spelling wise more correct than the first one. So it has applications in spelling correction. Similarly, if I were to give you an audio signal and I said recognizing speech or wrecking a beach, it could be that, like, just based on that signal, I could have been saying wrecking a beach or recognizing speech. They're somewhat similar, but because I have a language model, I can say that this thing is a lot more likely than saying wrecking a beach. So it's also used for ASR, automatic speech recognition. So if you have a speech signal that you are trying to convert into language, uh, and let's say you have multiple options, a language model can help you there, right? It can tell you that this seems like a more likely option. Similarly, let's say you have a translation model that gives you a few options like main wahan gaya. It could be translated, let's say, word to word by some model, or that could be a potential candidate like I there went or I went there. A language model will tell you that this is a lot more likely, right? This is more likely because this is how we write. If a language model is appropriately trained and appropriately built, it will give us more likelihood to the first sequence than the second sequence. So you can use this for translation if you have multiple possible translations of the same Hindi sentence, right? So there are lots of applications of language models, and in fact speech recognition was one of the first few applications of why there was an interest in language models to begin with. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how to develop these language models. That's, I think, of great interest to everybody. So one way to develop a model is to think about the generative story. So these are also popular things. Like when you think of a generative story, you think of a distribution, let's say a God given distribution. You have some way that the language magically appeared in front of you. You're trying to just recreate a way to have arrived at that generation, right? So that's what is called as a generative story. So you think about the data generating process, right? So you want to ideally estimate p of x, and let's say this is a sequence of words from 1 to t, right? You want to estimate probability of this sequence. So let's wear our generative modeling hat and think about how this data could have arrived. So let's say you go to Wikipedia, you see a lot of data. Some human beings wrote it. There was some process in their minds that led them to write it, and there's a lot of factors as to why they were writing what they were writing. Maybe they were frustrated, maybe they had tea, maybe they did not like their wife or husbands, whatever. Like, you, there's a lot of complication going around to figure out how that data came into existence, but we won't be able to model all of that, right? Obviously, that's just way too complex. So let's think of very, very simple, trivial ways of generating that data, or what is the generative story behind that data coming into existence. So one idea is, like, let's use a categorical variable. Let's use a dice. So instead of generating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's say I have a dice which has all the vocabulary words. So dice is a huge dice. Let's say it has 10,000 sides. It will look very weird. You might have never seen a dice that has 10,000 sides, but let's imagine it has 10,000 sides. And not every side is equally likely. Let's say the is more often present, or the word off is a lot more likely than the. So it's a loaded die of 10,000 sides, right? Many of them are words that we see in English. And there are two special tokens. Let's call them start token and stop token, just for convenience, just so that we know we have to start or stop, right? So one very simple way is, I will artificially say that I've generated start. I will keep rolling this die. Let's say I get the magically. There's a 7% chance, let's say I might get the. I landed with the. Okay. Then I rolled the dice again. I landed with shirt, let's say. Let's say I rolled the dice again and I landed with pencil. Uh, I rolled that dice one more time, and let's say I landed up with the word the again, or off again. So this could happen. It's a very, very simple model of generating language, or thinking about how the language might have come into existence. It's a very stupid model, to be honest, right? Like, nobody writes like this. Nobody has a die like that they throw around and generate language. So it's a very, very simplistic model of how language could have been written. So this is why we were talking about this categorical variable. This is now a dice with vocabulary number of sides with this. Okay. Thank you. Okay, parvaila.
That's that you understand.
Okay.
Screen also can be.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
No, but the people here can't see.
Okay. So can I request you to use some of these seats? Okay, perfect. So I move only towards my right. Okay. Okay, wait. Okay. Yeah, so this is a very, very naive model of generating language. According to this model of generating language, you are just throwing this die randomly, independently, word by word, until you land with this dice that has a stop word on the top, right? This is a very, very artificial way of thinking about data generation, but you would have that thought, right? So according to that model, you would say that, okay, I am sampling every word or I'm generating every word independently. So word 1 has nothing to do with word 2. It's just it's a word 2 is a different run or a throw of a die. Similarly, word 3 is a different throw of the die, and so on, right? uh, so you could potentially, like, you have essentially, because of this data generation process, you have assumed independence. You have assumed that word 4 is independent of word 3, word 3 is independent of word 2, and word 2 is independent of word 1. And there's also no ordering in place. Like, you don't care about this is the first word or this is the seventh word. You just have one dice, and you're exploiting that to just play around and generate language, right? So if I were to use this generative story and generate language like this, this would be my decomposition. This is the joint probability of the sequence of tokens, which I can now write down very simply as probability of individual terms according to this generative story. And it's a big assumption, right? This is not how languages are actually written. This is not how humans write. This is a very naive, simple model. It's called the unigram model, because you're only thinking of one word at a time. You are not modeling the context. In language, context is key, but we are not modeling that here, right? So now if I were to assume that all my data came from this particular generative model, and this is the story that, let's say, I imagine and believe in, how will I estimate the parameters of this theta? So first of all, what is the size of this theta? Right? So this is of size vocabulary. Why? Because there are vocabulary number of sides of the die that I can land up with. This vocabulary includes, let's say, the start and stop tokens, right? So it's no longer a 6-sided die, it's a vocabulary sided die. And I need to estimate all of these vocabulary number of parameters to tell you that, okay, how likely is the word the to come, how likely is the word of to come, is to come, Bangalore to come, and so on, right? So in this particular vector is a scalar for, let's say, Bangalore, right? Which will tell me how often is this particular word going to come. What will be the MLE estimate of this word? Anybody? So taking log and differentiation, sure, but if I threw a dice 100 times and one came 50 times, what was the MLE estimate of that? Half, 50 upon 100. So if I observe a lot of text according to this model or believing in this model, and I see Bangalore coming hundreds of times, like 100 times, out of total words, then this is going to be my estimate, which is nothing but very, very simple, right? Like, you don't have any other means to guess. So you're just saying, okay, I observed a million words, of which 100 of them were Bangalore or Bangalore. So looks like the probability or the MLE estimate of theta Bangalore is count of Bangalore upon total words that I've observed. So this is nothing but an MLE estimate. So just like the dice example, just like the coin cost example, based on the data that I've observed, this particular value of theta Bangalore will maximize the likelihood of the data that I've observed, assuming this generative story. Is that clear? Any questions about it? Again, it's a very, very simplistic model. You might not believe in this model. It's a very naive model. It assumes words are independent of each other. The order does not matter. But at least mathematically, are you able to relate that this categorical dice that you have, which has loaded sides, you have to estimate how likely is it to land on Bangalore. Your maximum likelihood estimate is going to say that how many times you have observed Bangalore upon total number of words that you have observed, right? Number of estimates. So the question is, what will happen to the accuracy if we increase the number of estimates? So, here the total number of estimates are vocabulary number. So yes, the accuracy will be a function of vocabulary. If you have only 2 vocabulary items, then you can only generate those 2 words. You cannot generate a rich language. So accuracy will, of course, matter with the size of the vocabulary. Similarly, if you have a very large vocabulary, you are unnecessarily carrying a large number of parameters for which maybe you don't even have a lot of observations. Right? Okay. So this is very simple. It's a unigram model. It assumes everything is independent. Let's look at a slightly better story. So this looks like a very fake story. No serious person will ever believe it. This is probably not how data is generated. Let's look at the generative story of the Bigram model. It says, again, let's start with the symbol start. Now, instead of having one dice, I have a vocabulary number of dice, right? So there are lots and lots of dice. And since the first word is start by definition, and because I have to start, I will go in the storeroom and get that dice. I will roll it. And let's say I saw the word the coming after the word start. I will marvel at this and, oh, this is the, let me go back to the store again, get the die which has the word the on it. That is the die corresponding to the word the. Now I will sample that dice. Okay. And it says, let's say office. Like it, you tossed that die and let's say it landed on the word office. You will go back to the storeroom and figure out which die corresponds to office. You will bring it back and you will toss it again. Maybe the word comes is, right? You will go to the storeroom, get the is die and toss it again. Maybe the word that comes out is, say, the office is closed, right? So this is like, again, a very, very simplistic model. But it is at least contextual. It is based on the last word, right? It generates output that is aware of the last word. So only the last word right now, which is why this model is called Bigram model, because we are thinking 2 words at a time and this word is only conditioned on the last word. Question? They do have to have vocabulary number of sites. If you're going to generate a vocabulary number of outputs, right? Like it will have to have those number of sites. Yeah. So it could happen that the first word was Bangalore, right? You know, because you have read so much that it's very unlikely to say Bangalore, Russia. So, but it is maybe in some contexts that could be possible. I visited Bangalore, Russia, and Japan. Could happen, right? It's not absolutely crazy. I agree it will be a very, very small probability. So that Bangalore dice will have Russia, but that edge will have a very, very small chance of coming on the top. It's a loaded dice. Not every word is equally likely to come on the top. Words that are unlikely to follow Bangalore will have a very small probability. Question? Yes, vocabulary number of dice, and each die has a vocabulary number of sides. Yeah. So we will get there. One more slide away. Okay. So is the story clear? The generative story. Again, this is also a very fake story. Language is not written this way. I'm just trying to motivate how language could have possibly been generated by this model, and this may not look like terrible. Right? So whenever we're talking about generative models, we tend to think about generative stories of those models. Yeah. Yes. Yes, 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 yes. So, so let's say if I have a Bangalore dice, maybe there is a very high chance that the next word could be traffic, right? Right, Bangalore traffic. Whereas maybe Japan traffic might be less likely. So, based on different dice, sides will have different probabilities, right? Okay. So, as per this model, what I'm saying is this is the decomposition, right? So this is, let's say, the start word. Probability of this word is conditioned on this. Probability of word 3 is conditioned on word 2. Probability of word T is conditioned on the previous word. Again, is this always true? No. This is a simplifying assumption that the word that I'm generating now is only dependent on the word that I've generated previously. According to this assumption, I can decompose this joint probability term into saying that let me generate the first word, and then based on that word, I will go to the store and get that die and generate the next word, and then generate the next word, and so on. Yeah, yeah. So technically, you're right. So what we typically will do is we will artificially add start and artificially add stop. All right. So this term will actually be P of W1 given start. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So how are these probabilities estimated? You have a lot of data that is lying that you have access to, which is what you are trying to use to learn the parameters of this model. So again, go back to the example of 7 heads and 3 tails. You want to understand what is the likely chance, what is the estimate that, what is the estimate of P? Like, what is the value of P that would have maximized this observation? Similarly, here you have lots of data available, textual data given to you, and you want to estimate some parameters like probability of the word traffic given Bangalore, right? If it's a representative corpus, then I bet this value will be high, right? Uh, right. So you are estimating terms like this traffic given Bangalore. So what will be the estimate of this? What will be the MLE estimate of this? So I will count how often does the word Bangalore traffic come together. Yes. Given the word Bangalore. Perfect. Of all possible words that could come after Bangalore, I am trying to look at how often does the word traffic come. So what if a sentence ended at Bangalore? So we don't have to. So stop. So you're thinking of this period as a special word. Think of this as just any other word. Think of comma as also another word. That's just a part of the vocabulary. Like you don't have to give special treatment to it. Just counting Bangalore traffic divided by Bangalore is enough. Yeah, yeah, great. So there are typically in practice, either you observe stop or you say that the length I is greater than, let's say, 100 if you want to generate only 100 word sentences. So there's typically an upper bound on how much you are willing to generate. So there's typically these two conditions. Okay. It might happen that stop never occurs out of chance, right? Uh, Good question here. Any more questions? So is this part clear? Like this is just nothing but an MLE estimate here. Similarly, if you want to say, uh, let's say Cubbon Park, right? So how often does the word park come after the word Cubbon? You will check in your corpus the frequency of Cubbon Park divided by Cubbon, and that will tell you the probability of park coming after Cubbon. Of course, there can be other things like Cubbon Road or Cubbon Adventures, but maybe park is one of the most likely things to follow Cubbon. So that probability will be estimated to be quite high using a corpus, right? And once you have these estimates, you can, of course, write down the probability of an entire sequence. One second. Okay. So, right. So that's the bigram model. It's conditioned on the past word. But you can start to observe, right? It all depends on the data you have. If you did not see Cubbon Park so often, but you saw Cubbon Road very often, maybe you were in a different city where there is a Cubbon Road. So you will generate text that is indicative of the data that you have, right? So this model will fit the data that you have. It will maximize the probability of the data that you have observed. Okay. So just to summarize, these are the three N-gram models, like a unigram model where you have a very simplistic assumption that uh, no word is dependent on any words in the context. Everything is independently generated. You can simplify and write this as a product of individual terms. The bigram model is this bigram story we were talking about, where the word that you have currently is conditioned on the word to the left. Like traffic is conditioned to the word on its left, let's say Bangalore. Similarly, trigram model is just one extension of unigram and bigram, where a word is conditioned on the past two words, right? So, like when we say n-gram, we say it's conditioned on the past n words, let's say, right? So a 10-gram model will be conditioned on 10 words, right? A 4-gram model will be conditioned on 4 words. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So we'll come to that. Hold that question. Yeah. Okay. So how will we estimate these probabilities? We already wrote down these formulas, right? So if you're using a unigram model, you want to understand what is the probability of the word uh, traffic. You will just count how often does the word traffic occur given n. Uh, Similarly, if you want to understand what is the probability of the word traffic given Bangalore, right? You will estimate, you will count number of times Bangalore traffic occurs divided by the number of times Bangalore occurs. One second. Similarly, if you were to say painful Bangalore traffic, you will count how many times painful Bangalore traffic occurs divided by how often painful Bangalore occurs. Right? These are all statistical models just computed based on statistics of the data that you have. Yeah, you had a question. This one, N. Yeah. So typically you will start with what we call as the corpus, right? So think of this as Wikipedia. You can wiki. I grew up with in an age where there was spelling correction, and that's quite apparent, right? So your corpus could be Wikipedia, your corpus could be internet. So this is just a sequence of words that are already given to you. So you can count how many words are given to you, and that is your end, right? So just to give you some example, let's say OpenAI GPT models are trained on trillions of words or tokens, right? So if there are a billion people, imagine everybody wrote 1,000 words. Not necessary. You could just say, I'm going to use a trigram model, and these are just simple. Yeah. So that time so for trigram models, you will have two start words. Start. Uh, just for notational convenience. Yeah, let's say so basically if you have a 10-gram model, the first word will not be conditioned on anything. Second word will be conditioned on the first word. 10th word will be conditioned on the first 9 words. But the 20th word will be only conditioned on the previous 10 words, not all the way till the first word. Okay. Okay. So you're saying can n be infinite in some sense? Yes. So we will build models where this n can be very, very large. Yes. Your question? Yeah. 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 So great questions. You're jumping a few slides ahead. We'll come to you. Okay. So hold that question. That will be answered. Okay. So how does, like, if I were to actually do this again, these were fake stories that I've been telling you all this while. But let's say if I were to believe in my stories and actually generate data as per a model trained, let's say I computed all those values using content that Shakespeare has given us, right? And a 1-gram model trained on Shakespearean data, when used to generate new data, will look like this, right? So this 1-gram looks crazy, right? There is rarely any grammar. To him swallowed, confess, hair both, which it doesn't really make much sense because it doesn't think about the previous word, previous words. There's no way it can capture grammar and anything like that, right? It's quite random. Uh, but it at least has popular words coming up, right? Like off, on, are, to, him. It does look Shakespeare. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, there are definitely things like Shakespeare, right? Like where, or like there's like maybe die somewhere. Yeah, here, right? So if we go to 2-gram models, right? This starts to feel a little bit better, but like he's trim captain, then all sorts. Uh, Okay, let's look at the 4-gram model where it's looking at 4 previous words to generate. I will go seek the traitor, right? King Henry, what? Some of the watch, a great banquet served in, right? So this is starting to look like some semblance of language that Shakespeare wrote. I mean, of course, I would be offending him and his like fans if I were to say that this is like really good, but this is like again just believing these fake simple naive models, you are able to generate something that sembles Shakespeare, right? uh, yeah. So you mean like increase n-grams or increase vocabulary? Okay, so we'll come to the case where what happens if we increase n to a very large value. We'll hold that question, we'll come to it. So a little bit about Shakespeare's work. Shakespeare in total wrote close to 80,000, 800,000 words, right? So he was very productive. And he had a very nice vocabulary. A typical vocabulary is roughly 20,000 of an intelligent person. Shakespeare was like Shashi Tharoor of their time, right? So a much higher vocabulary. Uh, right? But also note that the total number of unique bigrams that were generated by Shakespeare were only 300,000, right? Because not every pair of words makes sense, right? Like Bangalore iPad makes no sense, right? There is nothing like Bangalore iPad or Bangalore mic. Um, so some of those words will never occur. So there is a lot of sparsity. So in principle, there is a possibility of V cross V bigrams, right? There is a vocabulary that Shakespeare used. If all possible bigrams were permissible, you could have 844 million of them, but the actual number of bigrams that Shakespeare used were only 300,000, right? So 99.9% of all possible bigrams were never seen. So there is a lot of sparsity as you go from a smaller end to a larger end. So the sparsity for 4 grams is even more, right? So whenever you have something like, let's say, I will go, or let's say, go seek the, if these are the last 3 or 4 words, then there is only there is a very high chance that there is maybe only one possible completion as per Shakespeare, right? Because of the sparsity, right? So whatever you probably see here are these exact matches in Shakespearean text. So whatever looks like Shakespeare is likely coming from Shakespeare. So all these 4 grams are very, very likely to have actually occurred in his text, right? Uh, so one last thing before we take a break is, again, this is maybe absolutely obvious to you, but again, an important point to keep in mind. If you train on a slightly different corpus, the same fake stories I was telling you, like Wall Street Journal, this is all about news, business, stocks. Uh, the text will look very, very different. It's no longer Shakespeare, no longer killing, no longer traitors. We're talking about stock exchanges, years, foreign, 90 points, billions. So just based on the data that we have, our generations might look very different. Our vocabulary also might change. So this matters a lot. Uh, yeah. So we will, I know, sorry, we had a late start today. I also don't want to keep you for so long. Let's take a break. We will come back and finish this bit and then jump on to neural networks. Let's start at 12:05, if that's okay. Okay.
Do you want to pause that? Live? Okay. You want this back? That is.
Be patient with that. So this is it covering for you now? Where is this guy? Our Nagara. So you go that side, you go that side. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, you are with this. Some delay. Some delays. This is what we are seeing.
Yes, sir. This is what we
Suppose data is here. Coming. That is. Is it okay?
Yes, sir. Sir, sir. We move only when you move it. We should off the sensor, I guess. It should stop sensing.
Manual is there.
This is happening.
It is only focus. It's showing us that.
In our can I search what is this?
Textile. See, manual is only for focus part. How long I should keep pressing? After that, it is moving whenever I move. Yeah. Since manual is there, but it's the focus is links there. But it's not.
He's asking to hold that money in front.
No, it came after that. No, it becomes unknown. So it keeps on moving. Sorry, we will adjust this in such a way. Yeah. Audio, what will happen? Try. பார்த்துப்பா. Just helping. How long will it go?
You take from that side, you take that upset.
No. Bye.
So we can put it like this.
Something.
This side. No, sir, you should move the camera. Okay.
How to fold it? Is it holding?
Yes, sir. Holding it, sir.
How it will hold? Okay.
Coming towards white hole. That's
Okay.
it.
Oh, okay. This is too skewed, man.
Like this.
You have to keep it somewhere. What about you want to keep it in here without stool? Yes,
That's what, sir. Together we will
lift only without falling. Just keep it here.
we will remove this from this side, sir.
I will do. Hold this. Sound camera is just
Can we live stream from iPod itself?
Yeah,
That will be good. Yeah, it has a mic. It is a camera.
but
It has lights.
the slides also. Yeah, that will be great. Yeah, feeling that.
So need the password of the your AC Gmail account. So that I can
Yeah, we can do that. I think you should have tried only with your.
So each camera.
That is previous, sir. I think that.
No, no, this is what is happening.
Some sellotape or something you should keep on. Fall, no. You have some sellotape?
Yes, sir.
Did it.
I will.
Camera.
We will end it here so that it can be signed. So one is I want to be able to run from this.
Option to type the link.
This is the link.
It's already.
It's already frozen. It's taken here, is it? That's why. No, சரியா? Showing. Okay.
Did we change the stream? Somewhere?
Mhm. That board light you can switch off.
So we get, okay, what are those things?
Now this is actually focusing on you know, but automatic is almost there. It's there.
So one thing like share the slides. Put it.
I will put make the problem segment.
Chat.
We can. Yes, yes, it's email.
The light is working on.
Yes, sir, it is working.
So it will now I damage.
This is angle okay.
Wait. Go a bit behind that. Come back. Leave it back. Go behind.
Adjust this one.
So hey, when he's talking, we can't see that.
Yeah, fine. No, it's fine. It's nice. It's fine. It's fine. You can stand anywhere. It's fine.
Slide is good.
Yeah, it's fine.
So send this slide.
Yes, I'm sharing sir slides.
Can't you use another language? Sir, I think
Not as there's this view. So that's software. That's the this and the index services and what the tab with that in as
The thing is that 40% of amount of that so it's that 20%, it's very, very less. That no. Okay. Perfect. So okay, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. So let's begin. Is everyone with me? Okay, perfect. So we were looking at how just by changing the data that we use to estimate probabilities, the language that is sampled from those parameters could look wildly different. So this is generations from an N-gram model that was trained on Wall Street Journal, which is a news-like uh, corpus full of, let's say, stock related, financial related news. And this is already visible in the generations like $99.6 billion, 204, 6%. So whatever you train on is going to reflect in your generations, basically. Okay. So a lot of people here, have we used also as a word? Yeah. Full stop, comma, semicolon, exclamation mark are just like any other vocabulary items. Think of them as just a regular word. Yeah. Okay. So now let's look at a few more examples just to understand what are the issues that arise when we move to higher n-grams. So let's say we want to estimate the probability of please close the door. So for a bigram model, you will just count, let's say you want to understand probability of door given the, so you look at, let's say, how often this word the door occurs, which is the numerator here, right? And then you look at how many times is the word the followed by any other word, right? So this is count of the door divided by count of the. And this happens to be, let's say, 0.06%, right? So a small value. Similarly, you could go to a trigram model. Now you will look at close the, right? And now just because you have closed there is more context available. There are only a few things you can close. You can close the window, you can close the gap, close the deal, close the thread. And it so happens that door is the second best option here. Roughly 5% chance that you will complete the next word with the word door. So if you have closed the door is the second best option. Window is the first best option with a little more than 5% chance. All right. So you can imagine that more context helps here. So the door by itself was not very likely, 0.06%, but this is 5% because close there are only few things you can close. So higher n-grams can give you more specific probabilities like close the door, whereas lower n-grams are more generic like the door and so on. So if you go to a new sentence, let's say close the first door on the left, right? So it turns or please close the first door on the left. So it turns out that please close the first. This sequence itself never occurs in, let's say, the Wall Street Journal, right? Even though to us it seems like, okay, this is something a human being could have said easily. But if we are going to work with, let's say, 4-gram or above models, right? There is a lot of sparsity. By sparsity, I mean there are a lot of 4 grams, 5 grams that just never show up in text. So in principle, if you have a vocabulary number of items, and if you're looking at 5 grams, then principally there are v to the power 5 different options, right? Every combination of vocabulary times another, vocabulary times another, v to the power 5. But in practice, let's say if you observe 1,000,000 tokens, there are 1,000,000 5 grams, right? If you just traverse from left to right, of which the unique 5 grams might be even less than 1,000,000, right? So this value v to the power 5 is just way too high, and a lot of the possible combinations will just never occur in the text. So for instance, you will never say, please close the first red door, maybe, right? Even though it is something that you can imagine someone saying. This is what I mean by sparsity. There are many combinations of 5 grams that can principally come, but only a very small number of them actually are written down, right? So if we go from 4-gram to 2 grams, right? So on one hand, we have very specific things like close the door or close the first door. But if we get more specific, there's a good chance that we might never encounter that phrase altogether. So it can be specific but sparse. Whereas on the other hand, in 2 grams, if you're looking at this 2 grams, you will only capture the last word. So you will end up with only very general idea or very general probabilities, right? So think of this example. The door is 0.06%, but close the door is 5% because there is more context, and given close the door is quite likely to come. Close the window is also quite likely to come, right? So more context means more specific, but also means you might end up with no matches because it's going to be very sparse. So a natural question to ask here is that can we get a mix of both? We might appreciate the fact that we are not hitting a lot of sparsity in the 2-gram situation, but we are hitting a lot of specificity in the 4-gram situation. Can you balance those? So one very naive idea is that, like when you are computing a 3-gram model, take everything, like take lambda times the trigram probability, lambda 2 times the bigram probability, and lambda 3 times the unigram probability. So if you want to say painful Bangalore traffic, right? So this phrase will tell you how likely is traffic to come after painful Bangalore. This is only going to tell you how likely is traffic to come after Bangalore. This is only going to tell you how likely is traffic to come. So you are basically interpolating between unigram, bigram, and trigram estimates or probabilities to get best of both worlds. So you are not hitting sparsity by just considering higher n-grams, and at the same time you are also capturing the specific phrases that occur when they occur, like close the door, using higher n-grams. So this is one way to use both. One question is like, how do you decide lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda 3? Any guesses? Yeah. Great suggestions. So one intuition is maybe I want to pay more attention to this because it captures more context. But the other idea was like, let's just experiment, figure out experimentally what's the best thing. Good idea. So what people do is typically they will take lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda 3, and because they want this to be a probability, they all sum to 1. So they will try multiple values, let's say 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, let's say 0.2, then this will automatically become 0.6, whatever. Like you can imagine all possible combinations of lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda 3 in some intervals. Like not, you can't try everything on a real scale, there are infinite values. So let's say you try 5 combinations of lambda 1, 5 combinations of lambda 2. Once you have lambda 1, lambda 2, this one is almost fixed. So one idea is you try all the 25 combinations on a held out data set, whichever one works the best, just use that. So this technique is actually quite common in deep learning. It's called grid search. And these are not exactly parameters of your model. Parameters were probabilities that you were estimating. So these are in deep learning parlance called as hyperparameters. You might have come across these like what should be my step size, what should be my learning rate, and people just say it's a hyperparameter, which is just saying that I don't know what is the absolute best value to use here. Let's try a few reasonable options and see which one works the best. And I think you are also maybe starting to see the empirical nature of deep learning in the field in general. Yeah, question? Yeah, I mean, if all of them are, let's say 1, 1, 1, then these three all are values between 0 to 1. But adding these three could be more than 1. You still want this ideally to be a probability distribution. Right? So that is maybe one reason why you want to do that.
Can't we take the advantage of the sparsity if in such a big size of vocabulary? Like if we have V5, we
Yeah.
know that it has to be sparse.
Yes.
So a lot of things we can actually
Pro. Yeah.
We can actually search only in those.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like from a storage perspective, sparsity is not a good, not a bad. That just means we need to store less values, and there are interesting data structures that allow you to do that. Like tries allow you to do that, for instance. But let's say you want to say something that has never been said before, like please close the first door. That phrase never was written down or was never a part of, let's say, Shakespeare text or Wall Street Journal. Because now this seems like a reasonable combination, but it's not there, you will assign a 0 probability to it. So because that particular phrase is 0, everything else will become 0. So let's say if you are using this in a story, please close the first door and then move right and then do this. Just because of that phrase being 0, everything else will become 0. So you are saying that this entire story is impossible to occur. So we don't want that.
Interesting that you try. Is this represented as a try?
Yeah, higher n-grams are typically represented as tries. Tries is like one go-to data structure. There could be others too. Yeah, I mean, I won't get into tries now. That's a separate topic altogether. But look it up. It's a data structure to store these kinds of sparse n-grams. Right? There could be other data structures also. Yeah. So back in maybe 2005, 2007, 2010, the Google search that you see today for its auto completion would use a 7 to 10 gram models with interpolation. So these are not just fantasy stories or fake stories I've been telling you. These are practical tools that were at least used close to 2 decades back. Right? Okay. So N-gram language models are not completely useless. They capture a lot of small interesting details. Like for instance, she is amazing. They are amazing, right? So it knows that is more likely to come after she than are. So it has some sense of English grammar, right? It knows that is more likely to come after she than probability of are. Right? So by default, it understands this. Similarly, a trigram model might or a 4-gram model might be able to complete this. Beat around the bush, right? So it somehow has some awareness of idioms or some pop culture like Nike, just do it, right? Or given how the news situation today is, it's very likely to fill this up with PM Modi, right? And like so, in some sense, it knows who the Prime Minister of India is. It can complete the next word given this context. A trigram model will have a very high probability for probability of token Modi given Indian PM, right? So people generally ask, how does ChatGPT know who is India's Prime Minister? It's very simple actually. Even a trigram model knows that, right? Yeah. So the lots of things that a N-gram model cannot capture though, right? So for tennis class, he wanted to buy his own racket. For a programming class, he wanted to buy his own computer, right? So if I'm only looking at 4 or 5 words here, all of these are same in these two contexts, right? Wanted to buy his own. But only the word tennis or programming really tells you what this kid needs, right? Similarly, the word like bought and purchased are used interchangeably. So you bought a house, you purchased a house, you purchased a necklace. But for a N-gram model, these are just different tokens. So probability of what comes after bought a is completely differently managed than the probability of what comes after purchased a. Even though like we know that they are similar words, they mean similar things, we are just not able to share this context. Yeah. So if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8-gram will capture that, yes. But for even the 8-gram model, it has to see exactly this phrase in exactly this order to be able to like get that right. So we can hope that this had existed in the data and that is what you're completing. And also know that if this is in data, it will maybe be only once, very sparse also, and also very infrequent. So let's say maybe tennis class he wanted to buy his own racket. That's maybe only occurring once or twice. So you are literally stealing this phrase from your training data. So whatever in 4 grams look like Shakespeare is actually like his 4 grams, right? So you're literally like just copying in some sense. Okay. So these two issues clear. So these are some of the issues to keep in mind because we will return to some of these issues and we will show how neural models are better at handling these kinds of situations later. Okay. So by the way, you don't have to necessarily limit yourself to words. Nobody's stopping you to do that. You can build a language model where the base constituent is a character. So you can say instead of me modeling a probability of a sequence of words, I'm going to model a sequence of characters. So I'm going to say probability of S, U, R, and so on, all the way till H. And you can model this, right? So you can develop, let's say, a model of how Indian first names are written. And as you can see, there is a lot of shared patterns, right? Like there's a lot of patterns in Indian names, like because of maybe religious connotations, a lot of names end with ESH, like Suresh, Mahesh, like Manish, Manisha. A lot of the context is very, very similar. So you can say that, like, if I have observed probability of H given I and S is going to be very, very high, probably the highest among all the characters, right? So you can build a model for Indian names. You can potentially build a startup, a company, a website, sell this to parents who are looking for baby names, generate new names for them. So all this is like just by looking at data, you can mine patterns and like model some phenomena, like what makes a name an Indian name. Okay. So let's look at evaluation. We talked very roughly about, okay, we will experiment and see which one works, what is the accuracy. Like, what does it even mean to say what is the accuracy of a language model? Language model is just supposed to give you probabilities of sequences, right? What does it even mean to say that this language model is better than that language model? Right? So one idea here is that models should assign higher probability to real text. So the text that was, let's say, written by fellow human beings should get a higher probability compared to, let's say, gibberish text. So that could be one yardstick of evaluating the quality of language models. So there is this formula called Perplexity, which is a very simple formula. It is the nth root of the probability. So you can write this as probability of W1, Wn. And like you take the square root, think of this as the nth root, right? So this is the formula essentially. And you will only compute perplexity on real human sequences and hope that a good language model will assign a higher probability to real sequences. So if this value is higher, and since it's in the denominator, lower perplexity is better, right? So this is one of those rare metrics where lower is better. Generally higher is better, but for perplexity, lower is better. Why nth root? Because we want to also normalize by the length of the sequence. By definition, like anything that comes after this is going to have a lower probability than this is itself, right? Even though just saying this is in human text by itself is very unlikely. You will never say a sentence that says this is, right? You will probably say something after that too, right? So you want to normalize for length of the sequence, which is why there is an n term here. So it's like nth root. One, I think, other interesting interpretation of perplexity is that imagine every word was about as equally likely to come. Let's say you forgot to write your probability formulas, and all the probabilities of all the words are uniform. So every word is 1 upon v likely to come. Okay. In that case, this formula will become 1 upon v power n. If you take the square root of, if you take the nth root, it will become 1 over v. So the perplexity will become v in that case. So for a terrible model with just uniform probabilities of every single word, so this is a model where the word rabbit occurs about the same number of times as the word the. So clearly a stupid model will have a perplexity of the size vocabulary. And typically our vocabularies are 10,000 to, let's say, 50,000 in practice. So this is the range you should keep in mind. If your perplexity, if someone tells you that the perplexity of this model is 3000, like it's a very bad model. All right. And you might have heard of this startup called Perplexity here. This is where they're getting the name from, right? This is the Perplexity that they're maybe referring to here.
Are we not going to be independent? Like we are assuming that?
No, no, no. So these words are not going to be independent. This is whatever the model you're using. Every language model is by definition supposed to give you this, which is why we call them a language model. That's their only job. Uh, and so if it's a trigram model, it will leave condition on the last two words. So whatever model you're using, use that model to compute this value and plug it in this formula.
Did we say that model use the word with the maximum probability? So when you're predicting a word, let's say after a three-word phrase, please open the, and if the, will it always say door or will it in that ratio say it? So
Yeah. So great question. You are actually thinking about how to generate data, right? Here, what I'm saying is, let's pick human data that has already been written and was, let's say, not seen by the model. We want to test this model on unseen data. So let's say we took 80% of all the Wikipedia articles, the remaining 20% of the articles, we compute these probability terms for those sequences. And since it is unseen but still human written, a good model will assign a higher probability to human written text. Right, so that's the only thing we are using to judge the quality of a language model as per Perplexity.
How will the quality be biased? Is it the lambda that you said you are going to bias whether it's a good model or a not?
Yeah. So one, like, let's say you want to compare a unigram model versus a bigram model. One thing is you will look at the language and maybe it looks like more human-like and you stop there. Or you can quantitatively compute the perplexity of a bigram model and see whether it's actually lower than a unigram model. Yeah, let's say you might, if you have the same data, I might have a transformer based model, you might have an RNN based model, she might have a trigram based model, he might have a bigram based model. Everybody now says my model is the best. And that's actually happening, right? Like OpenAI is saying my model is the best, and Anthropic is saying my model is the best. How do we evaluate? So this is like one of many metrics to evaluate. So every paper will at least share what is the perplexity value on a known benchmark. Okay. Question, yeah. Yeah, so great question. So one thing is, if I use all of my data to do the estimation, then I have seen everything already. So it might not be the best test possible. So one typical practice in machine learning research is that you split your data typically in a 70-10-20 ratio called train validation test set. And test set is like this final unseen evaluation. So think of this as an exam time. If you do well on that, that's like a good, that's like the yardstick of bragging rights, right? Sorry. Yeah, so you can overfit these models on the train. So okay, so that's a really good question. So for the models that we're trying so far, unigram, bigram, trigram, there is little chance of overfitting. The only overfitting that can happen is if you have a very high n-gram model and that's just memorizing those sequences and can only produce exactly those sequences and nothing else. Then we can say that maybe they are overfitting in that sense. But there are honestly not many knobs to play around to really say that I've just memorized this data end to end, and that's how I'm overfitting to this data, and come a new data set I will not be able to do anything, right? So those concerns are a bit muted here, but when we go to like more powerful neural models, those concerns will become prominent.
But in the language, typically the text is not too much of sparse. So here there is in a overfit when we say typically it's a repeated way, and that's when my model will to do a bias. So in a language, when most of the text is kind of the same, as we already discussed. So obviously it makes sense that model will try to do a overfitting because 80% of the text is kind of repeated.
Yeah, I think so. So it'll take me a lot more time to really go into the issues of overfitting, underfittings, and they are not super important for N-gram models. Maybe we can take it offline. Yeah. Okay. So as I was saying, the perplexity of a uniform model that is a unigram model is V, which we just computed. And if you were to just look at the Wall Street Journal, this is the perplexity a unigram model gets, this is the perplexity of a bigram model, and this is the perplexity of a trigram model. And remember that lower is better, so trigram models are better than bigrams, which are better than unigrams, right? Okay. So overall, for the first lecture, which I was supposed to conclude by 12, we wanted to just cover N-gram models, understand how their probabilities are written, how their parameters are estimated, what are the sparsity issues, and how you can balance those by interpolating between unigrams to 4 grams. Let's say if you are working with 1 to 4 grams. I also briefly mentioned that they can be applied at a character level. And we briefly touched upon evaluation, and I discussed perplexity as one of the measures, right? So, any questions here before I like jump into the second lecture of the day? Written by a human. So all of this is like so all of this is computing perplexity on text written by humans. Yeah. So you're saying, let's say I use a person as a language model, right? So what is a human baseline? That's an interesting question, but a very impractical setup. I can't, let's say, ask maybe a student like Kinshuk to say, I'm going to give you sequences, you give me probabilities. That is just like not a human thing, right? Like people don't give you probabilities, they can give you like coherent text. Yeah. Yeah, you can. So again, to remember, you can compute perplexity of a language model on human written text or student written text. Students or humans are not language models. They cannot give you probabilities, or even if they claim to give you probabilities, they are going to be quite bad. And so it makes very like that's why people don't compute probabilities of humans. Like maybe the best thing you can expect here is, let's say, 1. So every sequence gets a perfect probability. In that case, the perplexity will be 1, right? So if you want to think of a really lower bound, think 1, right? Yeah, good question. So, so I think we started with this idea that language models are supposed to give out probabilities to texts, higher probabilities to texts that were written by people. So we are kind of like just by that definition assuming that there's something special about human written communication, human written text. Uh, of course, like if you're a Reddit user, you might not believe me, but whatever, right? Yeah, like and we started from there. We want to say that human written text is gold standard. We want to build a model that maximizes that probability. Question, yeah.
Was it used? What is that? N-gram models used in any?
Yeah. So basically, Google search autocomplete. So when you type Prime Minister Modi visit in, and you know how where the Prime Minister is, right, by auto completion, right? So that model right now in Google is a transformer based model, but 2 decades ago in 2005, it was an N-gram based model. So we are slowly catching up. There's 2 decades of work to be done, but we are getting there. Right?
Is there an end beyond which the value for X Like if it starts to go down, or like will it always?
So it can go down, as I was saying, like if it assigns a perfect probability of 1 to all the sequences.
No, I meant go up with n increasing with the.
Yeah, it can go up also, yes. So it's not like it's always a decreasing.
So if you test it on training data itself,
Yeah.
it will be very close to one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you test on training data, it might happen that there might be two possible completions. Like let's say you are both interested in playing football and cricket. So you have multiple essays written where you have said things like, today I played football, today I played cricket. And now the model can only assign one probability. Like if you're saying this model will give me a perfect probability of 1, then either it can say I played football today or I played cricket today. It cannot say both with the probability of 1, right? So if like so it can be close to 1. Yeah, like but generally language, because of its flexibility, has multiple possible completions. You will never actually hit 1. Yeah. Okay, great. So let's look at neural networks. So this is a bit of a segue into a different topic. So neural networks, we talked a little bit about language modeling, which is a task in NLP that's interesting. I gave you some ideas of like how statistical approaches compute, or how statistical approaches are used to build language models, just to give you some intuition about what this prediction machine is, right? So let's also talk a little bit about neural networks, which is a class of methods which were developed by a few groups, and a lot of research on neural networks happened in 70s, 80s in isolated pockets. And these models were never so good that they became mainstream until very recently. And so there were multiple waves or multiple winters of deep learning where like funding just died. Like there was very little funding. People who were actually doing neural networks had to use different means to just attract funding, because every time someone saw a neural network on a funding proposal, they thought this thing is never going to work, useless idea. I don't want to invest my money on, waste my money on it. But like that's maybe an important lesson for all of us to still keep chasing wild, crazy ideas. Going all the way back, the motivation comes from the brain. Motivation comes from a neuron in the brain. So these are biologically inspired, uh, right? And like again, biology was definitely not my strongest suit. I'll just give you a very brief overview of what a neuron looks like. It basically has a few of these dendrites where a neuron can get signal or input from other interconnected neurons, right? And if this neuron is activated, it will pass on the signal to, let's say, a bunch of other neurons, right? So this is like the broad, very rough idea of what a neuron in our brain looks like. Again, this is also maybe a simplistic explanation, but you can think of multiple signals coming in based on some quality of that signal. Either the neuron is activated and transmits that signal, or the neuron is not activated. So in our common like day-to-day colloquial parlance, also we say things like "oh chamka," like you got it, right? Right. So that's like the activated part of the neuron, right? Like, so those are the references. So some scientists took this inspiration and converted this into like what is called as a perceptron. So perceptron, just like a neuron, gets multiple feeds of input, like let's say x1, x2, x3 in this case. And depending upon the strength of this signal, it just sums these up. So this perceptron is a very, very simple, loosely computational model of a neuron. So what it essentially does is it just computes wi xi. It just adds w1 x1 plus w2 x2 plus w3 x3, and it passes that value, right? So if this value was high and the weight on this signal was high, then that has more influence essentially, right? So this is just a linear weighted sum, nothing fancy. Very simple. It's called a perceptron, right? Now, just to capture that notion of activated or not activated, you can say that if this value is greater than 0, I'm going to output 1. If this value is less than equal to 0, I'm going to output 0. So I'm going to output a Boolean value 0 or 1 based on the strength or based on the weighted average. Weighted sum, sorry. So again, very simple, but this thing itself can start to model some basic Boolean functions. So if you go back to your Boolean algebra class, you may know what an AND is. So AND is like 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? So if this is your x1, x2, this is your output, right? Very simple. So can you give me a W1, W2, and let me call it a B. It's generally called a bias, but you can call it a W3 if that makes your life easier. So what can the values of W1, W2, W3 be so that this function, this perceptron acts like an AND gate? No, not really, right? So 110 will give a yes for this one.
Maybe W2 can be 0, W3 can be 0, and W1 can be x2.
No. So this value is a fixed scalar value. It cannot depend on changing value.
W3 minus
1 minus 1, 1. Okay. Great. So if one of them is 1, I think you have developed an OR gate maybe. Like 1 minus 1, so that becomes 0. So in this case again it will output a 1, like this network, right?
minus 1 minus 1.
So by the way, W's can be real values. It can also be 1.2, 1.9, 1.935. So you are saying 1 minus 2 and
1 minus 1 1
1 minus 2. Okay. Okay. So here if it is less than equal to 0, so for won't work, right?
minus 1.
So shall we say minus 1.9? This works?
Yeah, it works.
So at least for this one it works. For the second one also it gives you a 0. For the third one also 0. Fourth one also 0. Right? Or are we making a mistake here? Okay, perfect. So very simple perceptron can be used as an AND gate. So long as you get these magical W's which you could yourself think of, we will figure out a way to automatically give you those W's. But for now, you can see for yourself that with some values of W's, it can mimic an AND gate. Similarly, with some tinkering, you can also make this an OR gate. So in OR gate, the only thing that changes is these two become. So what should I change here so that this works out?
Minus 1 and 1.
Say that again.
Minus 1 minus 1 0.9.
Minus 2, minus 2,
Minus 1 minus 1 and 0.9.
minus 1, minus 1, and 0.9. So if all of them are 0, then you get 1. So this is not working. So if both of them are 1, this is good. One of them is good, this is good. If both of them are 0, then this gives you a 0. Okay, perfect. 1, 1, 0 works, right? There are many values that work, right? For instance, 1, 1 minus 0.5 might also work, right? So a lot of values work, but this is quite easy. You can develop and use this as a OR gate. So what about this function XOR? Okay, so for people who don't know what a XOR is, imagine that this is a function where, let's say, you get 1 if the values are the same, but a 0 if the values are different. Okay, I don't know if this is XOR or negative XOR, but
Negative.
okay, this is negative XOR. Okay, perfect. So this is 0, this is 0, this is 1, this is 1. So let's say this is the function you are trying to model. So for the first one, this works. For the last one, this works. For the second one, this does not work. Okay, for the second one, it works, right? Second one, it won't 1 minus 1 plus 1000. So this will become greater than. Okay, wait. For this value itself, it does not work, right?
Exactly.
First one, it does not work. To fix this? Can it be done? Yeah, great question. So before you think about how to solve, you should think, can it be solved? So okay, so people who are maybe thinking a little bit about this form, this is a linear weighted sum, right? So whenever you are thinking of Wixi greater than equal to 0, if this is your decision boundary, then by default this is a linear function over your inputs. But if you actually look at XOR, this is the XOR, this is not linearly separate. I cannot, like here I can draw a line to separate OR gate, here I can draw a line to separate an AND gate. I cannot draw a single line to separate the XOR outputs. This is not a line, right? Yeah. So okay. So now you're thinking ahead. Nice. So single perceptron cannot do XOR. This was a key problem. This stalled the research for quite a few years until people figured out that, like what you suggested, how about I have an AND, I have an OR, and from Boolean algebra, I remember that I can get a XOR by plugging AND and OR. So how about I have 3 perceptrons, perceptron number 1, perceptron number 2, and the output of these 2 perceptrons as inputs to my third perceptron, right? So this is like some clever placing of perceptrons where the third perceptron is receiving inputs from the outputs of the first and the second perceptron. And turns out you can do this. Turns out you can use this 3 perceptron arrangement to model XOR. What will be the values? That remains your homework. You can figure it out. But it is possible. But one insight is, like, maybe you remember this from your Boolean algebra class, that XOR can be written as a function of AND and OR gates. Now you know that 1 perceptron is enough to model an AND, 1 perceptron is enough to model OR. So you can club those 2 outputs using a third perceptron to get a XOR. So this system is called a multi-perceptron system. Or if you were to like go crazy and have multiple perceptrons with multiple inputs throwing outputs to multiple other perceptrons, you can call that as multi-layer perceptron. Okay, so let's pause a bit before we go there. But at least you are maybe feeling comfortable that you can arrange perceptrons in a way that can model more complex things. So here, imagine that the input of this function is h1 and h2, which is a transformation of x1 and x2. So These are internal representations or representations of the input that are slightly different from the original ones but turn out to be helpful because in the space of H1 and H2 they are linearly separable. If this thing is supposed to work, then at least in H1 and H2 this function of XOR is linearly separable, right? So you are transforming your X1 and X2s into H1 and H2 such that if you convert inputs into H1 and H2, they are linearly separable. So let's say if H1 is just AND output and H2 is just OR output, and if we were to go back from that table right here, so 1 1 0 0 1 1 1 0 1 1 sorry 0 0 0, right? So if I were to write H1 here, that will be 1 0 0 0. H is AND. Let's say this is H1. Let me write H2 with the black. Let's say this is OR 1 1 1 0. So in the space of H1 and H2, this is linearly separable. So if you forget about X1 and X2, and let's say someone only gave you H1 and H2, this thing is linearly separable. Because if you are to plot this thing now, these 2 points of 1 are at this point 0, 1 here, right? So both point number 2 and point number 3 are here, where H2 is 1, H1 is 0, right? And these two other points, the first point is here. Let me denote it by 0, like here. And the fourth point is here. So I can now draw a line between them that separates them. So this might seem very simple, but I have been able to convert X1 and X2 into more useful representations that make this problem linearly separable. Okay, right? So we realize that this idea of using perceptrons to transform input into a different representation is useful because it can lead me to useful representations that might be separable. So taking inspiration from this 3 perceptron arrangement, you can imagine a slightly more crazy extension of this where you have multiple perceptrons. So you have n1 number of perceptrons and n0 number of inputs that are coming to this particular set of perceptrons. So let's say this H1 gets X1, X2, X3, Xn, and this also the first input plus 1. So this is like one perceptron. This is the second perceptron and so on. And the outputs of these perceptrons are now inputs to a next layer of perceptrons. So there we had only 2 layers. The first layer were 2 perceptrons. The second layer was just 1. Here you can arbitrarily scale this and say I'm going to have n1 perceptrons in the first layer, n2 perceptrons in the second layer. And this becomes a 2-layered feed forward network. It's only moving left to right. All the computations are going from left to right. So it's called a feed forward layer network. So, okay. So you can ignore this if you like, but in a lot of neural network pedagogical material, like they will typically have a bias term. So if your inputs were only X, your functions are only weight over X, then all the decision boundaries will pass through the origin, right? So just to offset this, you have something like +1 as an artificial input to which there is a bias. It's another weight, but it's called a bias. Which ensures that you don't necessarily have to have a decision boundary that passes through the origin. But in practice, what people typically do is they will consider the last feature as a 1, right? So these are all features. So artificially, if you had n naught features, you can think that you have plus 1 feature just so that this need not pass through the origin, need not pass through the decision boundary could be anywhere. Okay.
So is it always possible that if the decision boundary is non-linear with respect to x1 and x2, I can always transfer it into some space where that decision boundary becomes linear without using activation function?
Yeah, it's a good question. So without using what is called as an activation function, this whole thing can be still linear. So one thing that here we are trying to do is we are clipping this and saying that values above a certain point is 1, above a certain, below a certain point are 0. So I'm introducing a non-linearity because of this threshold. But there are more smoother ways of introducing a non-linearity. So there are a bunch of what is called as activation functions. You can look it up, like tan h ReLU, which look at all the outputs and will pass the output. So before you get this h, so this h will typically be, let's say, tan h, which is another function of wx plus. Right, so this is all, like, you can write this in a matrix format. Again, if you are not comfortable with linear algebra, don't worry about it. It's just the summation written in the matrix notation. And this is just tan h, which is a function that is a non-linear function. Similarly, a popular other function is called ReLU, rectified linear unit. This is what it looks like. So everywhere below 0, it is 0. Everywhere after 0, like this is the 0 point, it's y equal to x if x is greater than 0.
So technically you can model XR with different activity.
Yeah, technically you can have multiple activation functions. You can train a 3 perceptron system with, let's say, ReLU or other things and models or, yeah. You can also analytically by hand write those values also. If you think. Okay, so this is like I am making a few leaps of faith here by saying that a perceptron was just good. Outputs of those are transformed versions of input, which can be fed to other perceptrons, and just by increasing the number of perceptrons in number and in like layers, I am able to model more complicated things. Like XOR was a lot more complicated than AND, just so I needed 2 layers. But if you are thinking vision and if you have to recognize a face, maybe the first few layers model simpler things like edges or simple lines. But the next few layers will have compositions of them, like it will start to have, let's say, rounded stuff or a blueprint of an eye if you go out. So as you increase more layers, the level of abstraction increases because it's a more complicated transformation of pre-existing layers. Again, like, this is very, very hand wavy, just to give you an intuition. Yeah, but there are some results which show that some of these models can be a universal approximator. Under some assumptions, they can approximate a wide variety of functions. But again, like, we will not go there in this course.
Actually, this output layer.
Yes, you can potentially say that this output layer can
Act as another
hidden layer for maybe a third layer. So you can take the outputs of a 2-layered feed-forward network and make it a 3-layered feed-forward network.
No, but like here in hidden layer, you are inputting one also to all the edges. But in the output layer, you are not inputting.
Yeah. So this one business, you can forget about it by assuming that right when you have the features, you are adding one more dimension, which is 1. So that is only needed at the very first time. It's not needed after that.
It is not.
So you need to mathematically write this down to like get a sense. Because once you have added a bias term here, that bias term is a function, like this bias term is in the output of this. right? This output is a function of the bias term. So it need not pass through the origin just by virtue of adding a bias term here, just by adding one as a feature here. So you don't need to do that repeatedly at all the layers. Okay. Cool. So this is like just basics of neural networks that we're going through. So in neural networks, you will also see often people saying, "Oh, this is my computational graph. This is I'm doing a forward pass." What does that mean? So you can write these calculations as a graph, right? So even something as simple as a function of ABC, let's say C is equal to A plus 2B. Can be written down in this way, right? Let's say C is an input that directly comes here. So if there are questions, just ask me rather than maybe asking each other. So let's say there are intermediate values of D and E, which is like saying E is A plus B, D internally is 2B. So E becomes A plus 2B. And L is C times E, so C times A plus 2B. So a complex calculation like this can be broken down into individual nodes and how they are multiplied or added to give you this value. So this is a very, very simple computation graph of a very simple function. You're just saying what is being added and what is being multiplied, right? So this is what is called as a forward pass. You start with these three simple values of ABC and you get to this function using this graph. This is like very, very simple, nothing fancy about it. But I think this is interesting. This is the chain rule. But if you have to compute, let's say, dl of dd, right? So you want to compute the partial derivative of L, which is the final output. In this case, it was C into A plus 2B, let's say. Right? Yes, okay. So you want to compute, let's say, del of L by del of D, which is 2B, right? So D is 2B. So this quantity becomes a bit hard to think about initially. But again, if you know the chain rule, it's very simple, right? So you, like if you want to compute the partial derivative of dl upon dt, by the way, partial derivatives mean that just changing d slightly will impact L by how much, right? So that's what partial derivatives mean. And you compute dl upon de, you compute de upon dt, and you multiply these two, what is called as a chain rule, and this will give you dl upon d, sorry, right? So whatever compositions are available, let's say f of g of h, and you want to compute the derivative of the most inner thing, you can always apply chain rule. Again, like if you've done calculus, this should feel familiar. But this is very integral to deep learning because what you have composed by this 2-layer, 3-layer, or 10-layer neural network, you want to ultimately find those weights of that parameters. So these weights that I was making you come up with for and XOR, you need to be able to find them automatically using an algorithm, right? If the weights increase by so many, like if you add so many parameters, so many layers, you will not be able to write those by hand, right? So there's a very popular algorithm called backpropagation, which is nothing but an application of chain rule. So what it is doing is essentially it is computing the del of loss for every single weight. So it computes del L upon del W, which is any W that you need to estimate or any W that you need to really find the value of. So you were finding these W's through imagination or through thinking. But you can find this using a very simple algorithm called backpropagation. If you have a certain what in deep learning parlance is a loss, so you define something like a loss, which tells you how bad your function is. and you try to reduce it using what is called as gradient descent. So you decrease or increase your parameters in such a way that your loss decreases. And this direction of where you should go, like whether you should increase the parameter or whether you should decrease the parameter, that is given to you by del of L by del of W. Like you want to understand if increasing this parameter slightly, will that mean more loss or less loss? If it means more loss, then I don't want to increase that. I want to decrease that, right? So that is the simple algorithm of gradient descent. Most neural networks are trained using gradient descent or some version of that. So it's a very simple algorithm. It just computes a loss. Loss is a quantity that tells you how bad the output of your neural network is. So if you are doing XOR, let's say if it's making a lot of mistakes and it is misclassifying all the outputs, then that means you are incurring a big loss, right?
Obviously, output, right? Then I need to compare that and tell that's the loss.
1 second. Uh-huh. Say that again, please.
Supervised.
Yeah.
So basically,
Yeah.
you know the output, and that's how you calculate what is the difference
Yes.
and find the loss.
Yes.
But how exactly the back propagation works in terms of unsupervised?
Yeah, we'll come to unsupervised settings. I'm just trying to add a page here. 1 second. So basically, like you can think of a loss which is a function of all the W's. Let's say there are 10 W's and let's say there are some bias terms. B1 to let's say BK. Like let's say this is your loss is a function of this and it is computed on data, right? So you have a lot of X, Y pairs. So if you want to use this neural network to do classification or whatever tasks, you will typically have the input and a correct output. So a loss function will be like, writing this a bit more technically, it will be a function of X, Y, and all these parameters. Let's call this W and B, right? And based on some data set, based on the mistakes you're making on the data set, you will have a loss value and you will compute dl upon dw or dl upon db based on the loss you have, and you will very slowly update your w's in the direction that decreases the loss, right? So if my dl by dw is positive, right, which means that by increasing w I am adding more loss, then I should not increase the w, right? I should decrease it, right? So this is the equation that is used to update all the parameters. But this algorithm is called gradient descent. You might have heard of it in some form or the other. Like the optimization bit is not super interesting these days because most architectures are optimized by one version of gradient descent, like a optimization algorithm that's built, that's a variant of gradients and like some advanced form of let's say gradient descent. But that's like the key idea, yeah.
How do you decide the first W1? First values for W1 to W.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Like, where do you start, right? So maybe the most simple answer for this course is you start randomly. So you start with parameters that look like junk. They will give you outputs that are junk, but your loss is the guiding signal that will tell you that okay, there is a lot of error. You are not matching the outputs that you're supposed to match, right? And you will update your parameter so as to decrease your loss. So when you decrease your loss, that means you're matching some values to the outputs. And as you train more, as you update more, you will at least be able to get a very low training loss, which means at least on the training examples, you are getting all the correct answers. For all the x's, you are matching the y's that somebody gave you. So x could be, let's say, movie reviews, and y could be, let's say, the sentiment associated. If you're doing text classification. There's a question back there. Yeah.
The W vector should be always random vector.
To begin with, yes. it is only suggested and appraised better and work also. Why not study a lot proven that maybe a prior based on a business can be used so that we can converge quickly or even we can keep a hurdle point. But yeah, but the study, is there a study like that? Yeah, so there are some rule of thumbs like there are some papers like there's a Xavier's initialization. So if you were a researcher in 2014 or 15, you could have an initialization based on your surname, based on some idea of what is a good set of initial parameters. Again, those are also random, but they are within a range random. They're not like absolutely random. So there are like formulas which tell you like that you should sample with a uniform probability between these ranges. So you can look up various forms of initializations. Many of them are just like inbuilt these days in PyTorch or TensorFlow. Generally for neural networks, why not for even other statistical or machine learning models also? Right. So in statistical models like let's say N-gram models, we do not need random parameters to start with because we could directly estimate by looking at some basic statistics on a corpus. So there was no need. Why not business? Yeah. So ideally, yes, you could play around and really game this a bit more, but like a lot of these initializations are good enough to work across domains. So people have realized maybe that there isn't enough juice left to optimize on where you start from. But we'll come back to this question when we talk about post-training and pre-training. But yeah, like that's maybe like a good answer for now. Yeah. So largely empirical, like you run an experiment and you see what number of layers are enough for this task itself. Generally, deeper layers mean more abstraction, like it can capture more abstract features, but it's also a budget constraint mostly. Like you may want more layers, but you don't have expensive GPUs that can load that many layers. So to give you an example, let's say the best models of 2017 had 12 to 24 layers. GPT-4 on the other hand has thousands of layers. So it's not really like how much layers are needed, it's more like how much layers can you pay for.
Number of times you go through with the same number of networks, same number of them, and compute W, you'll get some value.
Yeah.
And you'll have a loss.
Yeah.
So you keep going ahead and keep trying to reduce the loss by recomputing W more and more.
Right.
Or do you add one more layer and say, okay,
Right. So if it goes here, right, this W's is different from this weights. So this is a W, this is a U. So all the weights that are coming through this perceptron are different than let's say weights associated with this perceptron. So you're not reusing weights. Each
not that, but let's say that you decide that W is fine. I will write one more layer which can transfer W into something else.
Yeah.
And then use it from there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I keep pushing it and keep adding more layers to offset the issue that I have with W in the first place.
So you're saying, can I balance a poorer initialization with more layers? Like possible, but I think that's not how people generally think of these two design choices. So people know for a fact that these initializations are relatively reasonable, and the choice of how many layers to add is largely a function of how complicated the task is, how much data I have, and how much compute budget I have to like really extend the size of my architecture.
Stop the training process in terms
So-
of W.
So basically, that's a good question. So typically, your training curves would like again like this. It will keep decreasing because you're always updating in the negative direction of the loss. So you will keep getting a lower and a lower loss. But it might happen that you are so like specifically in a fragile way, just updating to suit the needs of the training data. So what people typically also have is another data set, what they call as a validation set, where you will have a loss that goes something like this. So this would be an ideal stopping point. So this is a point where you say that, okay, I am no longer seeing drops in my validation loss. So this is a good point to stop. All right. So that's one way to do it.
Sir, you talked about the number of layers. What about the number of nodes in a given
Yeah,
layer?
yeah, yeah. So that is also what is called as a hyperparameter. So you will experiment with what is a reasonable size. There is some intuition on what is good, what is bad. It will, I think we'll get into that. But yeah, that is also largely a concern about how much uh, parameters are you capable of holding in your GPU. Yeah, please.
Like the
Nodes
they were
are-
in,
this one's in there.
you said nodes are hyperparameter.
Yeah, so like how many nodes here, right? How many perceptrons to have? Like what is the value of N1? I don't know, right? Could be 100, could be 1000, could be 10,000, right? So, and if I have 10,000 values, that would mean those N naught plus 1 features now also are inputted to more nodes, which will mean more parameters. More free parameters mean I need more data to estimate those, which also mean I need more GPU storage, GPU space to load those. So that becomes mostly a question of how big a model can I fit in my GPU.
What are then what is that for that after the model has been trained and then also we have some parameter which we can tune?
Yeah, yeah. So typically you will it's called pre-training. You will pre-train a model and then let's say you might change it a little bit and that's called fine tuning. We'll get into more details of that in the next weekend. But yeah, like for now let's stick to this then.
Yeah. So like the Xavier initialization for the values of perpetuity, is there any kind of statistical values where I can use some intuition of how many number of nodes I can use?
Yeah, so there is I'll give you more practical answers to this in the next class. So like bear with me, but like there's some intuition as to how much embedding space you need. We'll come to that. It will become more clear. Yeah. What is similar like W and yeah, okay. So there are lots of studies on like geometrical interpretations of weights and what do they mean. But again, like that's not a part of the course, and they are also not so clear that they are informing how to do language modeling. And it's an explorative direction of research. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'll maybe say a couple more things before we end today. So one is how do we use a neural network on text, right? Because we care about language modeling, we care about textual data. That's what I'm talking about. So let's say let's say I want to do classification and the sentence I have is desert was great. So I can build a few features that are associated with, let's say, these 3 words or the sentence that I have that I want to classify. One feature could be how many words there are. One could be among the set of positive words I know, how many of them are there in this sentence. How many words are, let's say, no. Right? So let's say I have a very simple featureizer that actually converts this input into these 3 features, x1, x2, and x3. Once I have a piece of text down to a few numbers, I have featureized it, I have converted it into like real values, then it is compatible with the neural network, right? You can use that as features and pass that to the first hidden layer, then the second hidden layer, and so on, right? So if you go into a bit more detail, let's say we have 3 features here, right? So n is 3 here. So you have basically, let's say dh number of hidden layers. So you need dh cross 3 weights. For every neuron, you need 3 weights because there are 3 features that are coming in, right? And That is your first set of weights. And now you have, let's say, DH number of hidden units. These are like, this is the intermediate layer, so it's called the hidden layer. And now this goes into, let's say, 3 outputs. You're predicting whether it's a positive class, a negative class, or a neutral class. So this DH cross 1 is transformed into a 3 cross DH. So you do U, this is a matrix multiplication, and that gives you a 3 cross 1. So you get these 3 real values out by just doing these multiplications. So you do Wx, some non-linearity, let me just call it F, that gives you H, okay? Then you do U of H to give you Y. Y is still unnormalized raw real values. So these could look like, let's say, 9.3, 1.1, minus 5.0, right? Because you started randomly, they can look very random. Now, there is a standard trick in deep learning to convert a real vector into a set of probabilities. It is called softmax. Okay, so softmax basically does something very simple. It exponentiates every single value and divides by the sum of all the exponents, right? So I will exponentiate e to the power minus 3.2 and I'll write this down. And now, just so that it sums to 1, because I want to convert this into a probability vector, if I have 3 classes and I'm, let's say, 9.1, 5.5 and minus 10, I will apply this formula and I will get something like, let's say, 0.9, 0.07, 0.03. So it will, let's say, sum to 1. Maybe a more concrete example is, let's say, if I have 162, this is the output I will get by applying this formula. This is a very, very standard formula called softmax. It does not change the max, if you can see, right? So 162, the second guy was the highest. In the formula on the right, the second guy is the highest. So if you are leaning towards, let's say, a negative class here, that does not change, right? Because you're just exponentiating it. So you can imagine why this name came into existence, right? It's a soft way to take a max. So softmax. It's a way to convert any real vector into a probability vector, right? So this is something you will typically do towards the very end of a neural network. So let's say we were here, we had gotten these values of 9.3, 1.1 and minus 5.0. You will exponentiate each and normalize to get some probabilities. Let's say you get 0.6, 0.3, 0.1. Okay. Now, one second. Now, you realize that this sentence was positive. And my model is saying that it is positive, but only with 0.6% chance. So you will say, I will add a loss, which is the negative log likelihood of this sentence being classified as positive. So I'm going to say what the negative log of the positive class given this input. Right? So negative log likelihood. So forget the negative, forget the log. You just want to, let's say, increase this positive term. You want to make this higher. You want the model to be more confident rather than just saying 60%. This is a very simple example. It should say maybe 99%. So you will penalize this network and say, this is not good enough. Give me better weights so that I have a much higher probability of saying positive. So log is generally used with probabilities and multiplicative terms purely for underflow reasons. You don't want to multiply very, very small values. Computers are not very good at it. There are underflow issues. You might have learned about this in a programming class. And so you just compute logs. Logs are convenient from that perspective. they will never underflow, and instead of multiplication you add. So if you are doing multiplication of terms in log space you add those, right? So you want to maximize this probability or maximize this log, or you can say I want to minimize the loss. Like loss by terminology itself seems like something negative. You want that to be less. Like if you're betting on Dream 11 for tomorrow's game, you want your loss to be less, right? So you want to minimize it. So that's why there is a negative sign, right? So typically that's the objective: negative log likelihood of the correct class given the input, right? So this is going to be your loss because it was a positive sentence. If it was a negative sentence, you will say that loss is negative log likelihood of the negative sentence. So you want to basically, so this will, remember, only be 0 when this term is 1, right? So as this term tends to 1 or goes closer and closer to 1, it will never be 1 because of the softmax, right? But it can be very, very close to 1. But as it becomes very, very close to 1, this value will go down to 0. So for your network to actually, so you will keep punishing your network until it says P of positive value is 0.99999, right? So that's when your loss will actually be very low for just this example. Similarly, you will have another example which says that maybe the coffee was terrible, right? So because of the word terrible, you want that to be a negative sentiment. So you will keep updating your W's and U's until you get a very low loss on that example. And similarly, there are thousands and thousands of examples that you want to train your model on and adjust your W's and U's on so as to be able to get a low loss. This is what we mean by training a neural network. Right? You are essentially adjusting the parameters of a neural network so as to get a low loss, which also means so as to correctly classify a set of examples. Right? Any questions about this?
During the input, in normal and then the input, right?
Yeah, so there are
Why
lots.
don't we apply the same technique at the end? Because you compact also do the same.
So when we have like what do you mean by flattened input?
Bring down everything to the range of normal.
Okay. So, okay, great question. So you're saying like, let me change 9.3 and like, let's just subtract the max, add the mean, whatever. You can do all of that, but softmax has a lot of other interesting properties that is useful from an optimization perspective. So softmax is like the go-to normalization tool. You can potentially use other normalization tools. No one's stopping you, but this one happens to be among the best.
Start with random W's, and then you realize that the loss is high.
Yeah.
So the next loop that you do, you again give random values.
No. You will never go back. Once you start with random, you will always continue to improve. So you will keep iterating.
Or is it just like one now I'm going to?
So basically, let's say you had, let's just look at just one W here, right? So let's look at just one value that is the weight of this one that goes to this one, right? So let's just look at W11. So let's say this value was 0.93, right? Or let me say 8.93, okay? And now you realize in order to really get this to a very high probability, you had to move this value to 8.99. So for the next example, you will start with 8.99.
No. How did I know that I should move it to 8.99?
Because of gradient descent. Yeah, you have to compute a loss and then you have to take del of this loss with respect to dW11. So it will tell you increasing this value will increase my loss or decrease my loss. So in this case, it says increasing your value will decrease the loss. So you increase it from 8.93 to 8.9.
For all the weights.
For just this weight, similarly, you will compute that formula for all the weights. And you will update every single weight of this particular two-layered neural network to adjust it to have a very, very low training loss. Okay. One second. Okay, perfect. Yeah, go on.
So we will train this one by one, right?
Yeah.
So what is stopping the next sentence to undermine?
Yeah, great question. So, like, let's say I improve, I took it from 8.93 to 8.99, the other sentence took it back, right? Could happen. But over multiple examples, you might lead to configurations where, like, you are, like, basically, you might be able to get to a set of parameters that give you lower loss. So, as soon as you start going to a lower loss regime, your updates will also be small. Does it make sense?
Are there problems for which that would not be the case? There are no possible configurations where.
Yeah, so that's where I think these theoretical results come in picture. So there are theoretical results saying that even a two-layer fully feed-forward network can be a universal approximator given certain assumptions. So technically, it's possible that there exist these weights that will get you a very, very low loss. The question is then, is your optimization algorithm good enough to find you those weights?
But
There exist those weights. Yeah. So they're very, very expressive. So people say these things, right? Like neural networks are quite expressive. That is what they mean by this, that you can represent a very wide variety of functions using simple neural networks. With just two layers with infinite number of nodes. So that result is very theoretical in nature. This is a 1994 paper. I can send you if you're interested in looking at the details. But those results have existed for a long time.
Can you tell me that loss doesn't converge after training for loss and loss of iteration?
So, great question. So, it can happen that the loss doesn't converge. So, there are some tricks in deep learning to do that. One is like you, instead of saying that I'm going to just do subtract this, there's typically an alpha here which is saying what is the step size of my movement, right? Am I going to like really like subtract the entirety of it or like a small portion of it? So you can play around with this to see whether that helps your convergence. So sometimes you might be making baby steps. In that case, you need to increase your alpha, or you might be making so many big steps that you are actually your loss is increasing. In that case, you need to decrease your alpha. So what alphas work is a hyperparameter. So that's something you have to play with. Yeah.
Question. So sometimes, like you demonstrated a text classification problem here. Sometimes, I mean, in terms of competitions, they look for F1 score.
Yeah.
Instead of loss, if we
Yeah.
optimize on the F1
Yeah, so great question. So one thing is like you need to be able to compute this value of dl upon dw. Turns out F1 score is not differentiable, right? So it is a very weird quantity. It's not differentiable.
But how can I guarantee that minimizing this loss will give me the
Yeah, so one thing you can see is that if you take this number very, very, very close to 1, which this loss promotes, ultimately you are also deciding your decision based on what is the highest of these three options, right? So if this is 1, this is 0, this is 0, then the highest is also correct. So classification accuracy and cross entropy loss of this negative log likelihood are very, very correlated, right? So getting this to 1 also means you're classifying this example right. Yeah. Okay.
So calculating like softmax or log likelihood, they are computationally expensive. So like and we are doing it again and again, like 10 times we have to compute and softmax.
So one thing is like you do this matrix multiplication. So the formula I wrote here, right? So this is also where I think GPUs come really handy. So GPUs were these gaming apparatus which were designed exactly to do these kinds of operations for rendering 3D graphics. But some smart kid figured out that I can use it for deep learning, and rest is history, right? Like you can look at NVIDIA's talk for that. But the point being that this is a very, very cheap operation on a GPU. It's actually about as like yeah, and it's quite fast, like which is why GPUs are so important.
This matrix multiplication.
Yeah, it's a matrix multiplication.
In the softmax, we are actually calculating the.
Yeah, that's a different operation, but yeah, like that is computationally intensive, but any normalization will have some computation, right? And you need it.
So, like we have hardware for that, or it's just.
So basically, a lot of these functions are very, very efficiently written down for GPUs. I mean, Yeah.
Train our model.
Yes.
So we can get stuck in local minima, right?
Yeah. So
How do we?
so it's a great question. So these are maybe not convex functions and all. So that's a great question for an optimization class. But often it turns out that these local minimas are okay. Like they're good enough, they will still give you a good accuracy on a head load set. Yeah. So I don't know, for instance, it could very well be the case that GPT was optimized and it's in a local minima. A separate set of parameters might have given me a better local minima, but that local minima is good enough.
How do I
Yeah. So we'll come to that. So far I have only discussed what is a loss when I know what is the correct answer. Only then I can say that, okay, this is not as good as what I want, so there is a loss that I have to incur. But when there is no output, what to do, I will go to it in the next class. So this is, I think, a good point to stop, and we will cover a bit more about feed-forward architectures and then move to RNNs and transformers. So I'll stop here, but happy to take questions.
What you wanted? That these things I'm not sure. I think you will have to write the email to one.
stop first? How does we confirm whether we have sent it?
You wanted this sheet at Xerox.
See, in our college, we have a point which is in the work day, we should get a attendance certificate from the right way attending. That's a.
That I should just check with her only. Which her only. Fine. I'll just give a call to her. You can talk to her alone. No, she's not.
Goal is instinct. And